human beings had achieved an insanely high level of sophistication. What they had done in Egypt is still, to this day, one of the most confusing things that anyone's ever been able to accomplish. There's distinct evidence of a very advanced culture, and it exists all over the world.
Sacrifice, torment,
samurai sword practice,
and hygiene. Somehow it's all here.
Yeah, and none of it's good.
Nope. Let's get into it.
Ling Qi, usually translated to death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of execution in China dating back to the 10th century. And aside from how grim this was, it also held a much deeper meaning. If you were sentenced to die this way, it meant you'd messed up in the worst way. Ling Qi was reserved for crimes like treason, matricide, and patricide, or mass killing. The condemned would be tied to a wooden frame of some kind, usually in public, and then it's pretty much exactly what you'd imagine. They'd be cut over and over again until they eventually died. Sometimes the process would be drawn out, sometimes it would be a bit quicker. There aren't a lot of detailed historical records on the exact ways in which this would be practiced, so it would have varied quite a bit, depending on the crime and who was in charge. Not only would this have been a horrific way to go, it was also seen as incredibly humiliating, and on top of that, it was believed that those who died this way would suffer in the afterlife as well, with their bodies not being whole after death.
You think that's bad? Listen to this, because next on our list we have something called the BLOOD eagle, a ritualistic form of execution performed by ancient Vikings throughout the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th century. Rough time to be a Viking enemy. I'm warning you now, it's about to get graphic. The BLOOD eagle consisted of a person sitting upright and then having the skin on their back cut down the middle and peeled to either side, and then having their ribs severed from their spinal cord in the back with some kind of ancient blade that probably wasn't sharp enough to do the job very quickly, meaning the process most likely took hours. Once severed from the spine, the ribs would then be broken to be positioned outwards like wings coming out of the back of the body. The back skin on either side was then attached to hooks, the hooks to ropes, and the ropes to two large wooden poles on either side of the person so that the Vikings could properly and gruesomely display their sick, eagle-inspired abomination.
The Celts were often described as barbarians by the Romans. They were said to often rush into battle totally nude, they practiced strange rituals, and they had a real love of heads. Now, history is often written by the victor, so the Celts being these wild barbaric tribes may have been overstated, but there was some truth to what was written about them. Like the head thing, for example. Collecting heads as trophies is something a number of ancient civilizations practiced throughout time, but the Celts took things to a different level. They believed the soul was housed in the noggin, and liked using the human heads they lopped off in battle as decorative pieces. They'd hang them off their horses, they'd nail them to the walls, and decorate the fronts of their homes with them. Kind of like demented versions of Halloween decorations, only they weren't trying to be spooky. It was kind of like them putting their medals and trophies in their front lawns.
Next up we have the Mayans. Just as a whole, those guys were super twisted. Honestly, it's hard to even know where to start. As a society, the Mayans were super big on torment and sacrifice, often removing the heads or hearts of their enemies in drawn out ways that many times began with beatings, burnings, and scalpings in order to appease the gods. These sacrifices were often made when new buildings or leaders rose within the civilization, and they were great architects, so that happened a lot. Another pretty gruesome thing they did is they played their own version of soccer mixed with basketball, except it wasn't that much like soccer or basketball because the team that lost had their heads cut off and used as the ball in the next round. Speaking of heads, they liked theirs flat and long, so they often used wooden boards strapped to the heads of young men and women to elongate their heads, and they also filed their teeth into points. I'm sure there's more, but let's leave it there for now.
Gladiators were held in pretty high regard in ancient Rome. Sure, many of them were slaves and criminals, but not all. They were all seen as strong, virile warriors though, and that meant there had to be some special power running through their veins. So when a gladiator died, it wasn't uncommon for parts of their bodies to be used to cure different ailments. Epilepsy was a big one. It was believed that consuming the red stuff from a fallen gladiator would give the epileptic person some of the strength the gladiator had in life. Gladiators' livers were also believed to be a powerful medicine, and even when it came to cosmetics, parts of gladiators were used. Their dead skin would be scraped up from bathtubs and used in face creams, which for some reason grosses me out the most. Imagine finding out that UFC fighters' dead skin was used in your bottle of facial moisturizer.
Next up, while not as gruesome as the rest, I have a feeling talking about bed bugs is gonna make it pretty hard to sleep tonight. I get it if you're mad at me, but just remember, I'm doing it to myself too. Bed bugs were rampant in ancient times, and there really wasn't any way to get rid of them, meaning that ancient civilizations just had to deal with the infestations, the bites, and the itching, which of course often led to infection. The oldest bedbug specimen found in Egypt was 3,500 years old, and it was discovered in 1999. But recently, at the Mile Point Cave site in Oregon, researchers discovered an even older member of the bedbug genus that lived over 11,000 years ago and would have likely fed on hunter-gatherer civilizations who seasonally frequented the caves. Yeah, count me out of this whole thing.
How did a samurai test the quality of his katana back in the day? Traditionally, they would duel other samurai in what was known as Tsujigiri. Sometimes they'd practice with their new blade on criminals and corpses as well. But there was one other way to test the quality of a new katana or fighting style. Just attack a random passerby in the street. In the Sengoku period, the word Tsujigiri took on a whole new meaning, referring to samurai often testing their blades on innocent people out in the street. They would need to know their blade could cut through a person effectively before taking it into battle. So if there weren't any other options, what better way to test a sword than by doing just that? Usually the victims would be commoners wandering the roads alone at night. Tsujigiri started becoming a real problem in the Sengoku period. The samurai just had too much power and seemed to kill indiscriminately. By 1602 though, the practice was outlawed, with offenders being sentenced to death. But that didn't mean it just stopped immediately. In the early years of the Edo period, innocent people were still being sliced up in the street.
Here's something gross about the ancient Egyptians. Not only did ancient Egyptian men love the company of beautiful women, some of them really didn't care whether or not the woman was alive or dead. And so, as was typical in ancient Egypt, when a man died, he was embalmed right away, but when a beautiful woman died, she was actually left to decay for 3 or 4 days in order to make her less desirable to embalmers tasked with working on the preservation of her body. While this might seem a bit extra, it was actually super necessary, because it's not just something ancient Egyptians woke up one day and decided on. It was their solution to a very real problem that became apparent to the rulers of the civilizations after one too many embalmers had gotten caught in the act.
Speaking of ancient Egyptians, there was another practice that was pretty disturbing by today's standards. It wasn't uncommon for servants to be buried alongside their deceased masters, especially those of high rank, like pharaohs. This practice was seen as an honor, not a punishment. Egyptians believed strongly in an afterlife where they would continue their existence, and it was important to make sure there was a smooth transition. Being buried with their master meant the servant could continue serving them in the afterlife. Yeah, imagine you had to go into work one day and you found out your boss had just died. Then you're told you have to join them in their burial just because you work for them. Might sound strange to us today, at least I hope it does. Where are you working if that doesn't sound strange? But back then, it was seen as a sign of respect and devotion.
And finally, let's talk hygiene. While when you think of ancient civilizations, your mind generally does not jump to self-care and cleanliness, rituals of cleaning and freshening up did exist back then, although they may as well not have. For this last point, I'm going to be specifically talking about ancient Roman hygiene, which for starters consisted of toothpaste fashioned out of powdered rat brains and using one's own urine as mouthwash. whitewash. I love history movies, especially ones like Alexander the Great, but it's times like this that I'm super glad they haven't created some kind of 4D viewing experience that allows you to follow the movies with all 5 senses, especially smell. Oh, and remember a few years ago when toilet paper went flying off the shelves and people who didn't get to it in time started seriously freaking out? Well, the Romans wouldn't have minded because their toilet paper was actually just a sponge tied to a stick that they shared. Oh, and due to methane buildup caused by a lack of irrigation in ancient times, their toilets often exploded. Oh, and their band-aids were made of cobwebs, but that's all the time we have for you today.
Humanity, we've come a long way, but you gotta start somewhere.
I really hope there weren't spider eggs in those cobwebs.
Oof.
Just a little more nightmare fuel for you.
Yeah, people around the world, we all got some interesting pasts. With all that said though, I've been your host James.
I've been your host Anna.
We'll catch you next time.